Hunger doesn't make you cruel. It just shows you who you really are. The wind scraped across the dead valley like sandpaper on steel, carrying dust that tasted faintly metallic against Daniel Hayes' tongue as he adjusted the cracked seal of his respirator and checked the blinking numbers on his wrist display. 312 calories remaining, 1 ration bar. Estimated survival time 26 hours if he stayed still, less than 12 if he kept walking. And he kept walking because stopping out here meant letting the silence close in, and the silence always won. His boots crunched over brittle ground that hadn't seen water in years. Each step measured, efficient, his body running on habit more than strength, because strength had been gone since yesterday. Maybe the day before. Time blurred when your stomach folded in on itself, and your thoughts narrowed to numbers and distance, and the next place you might find something edible, something not poisoned, something not already stripped clean by whatever else still survived on this forgotten rock. He pulled the ration from his pack without stopping, turning it over in his hand. The foil creased and dulled from too many checks, too many moments like this where he almost opened it, and then didn't. Because once it was gone, and out here that meant something final, something quiet and irreversible, and he wasn't ready for that yet. A low sound broke the rhythm of his steps, so faint he almost dismissed it as wind slipping through broken stone. But it came again, thinner this time, uneven, like something trying to breathe through exhaustion, and Daniel froze, every instinct tightening as he scanned the ridgeline, the shallow dips in the terrain, the jagged remains of what might have once been structures, his hand hovering near the side of his pack out of reflex, though he knew there was nothing in there that could help him fight, only tools to last a little longer, and even those were running out. The sound came again, closer now, and he moved toward it before he could talk himself out of it, boots slower, quieter, each step deliberate as the wind shifted and revealed a shape half-collapsed against a slab of rusted metal, too still to be a threat, too small to be anything dangerous, and yet he hesitated, because hesitation kept you alive, because mistakes out here didn't get corrected, they just ended. When he got close enough to see her, the hesitation changed into something else, something heavier, because she wasn't a threat, not even close. She was barely holding together, her frame slight, her skin a pale shade of blue that looked almost translucent under the dust, her breathing shallow and uneven like every inhale cost more than she had left to give, and her hands, thin and trembling, were clutching at something on the ground, a patch of dark organic residue he recognized immediately as toxic runoff, the kind that would burn through a human system in minutes, and she was trying to eat it anyway. Daniel stopped a few feet away, the ration suddenly heavy in his hand, his mind snapping back to the numbers, to the rules that had kept him alive this long. Don't share, don't risk, don't get involved, because every extra variable reduced your chances. Every deviation from the plan shortened your timeline, and he had already calculated his timeline down to the hour. She didn't look at him at first, too focused on forcing herself to swallow something her body clearly rejected, her movements weak but stubborn, driven by something deeper than logic, something he understood too well, and when her head finally lifted, her eyes met his for just a second, not pleading, not expecting, just aware, like she had already accepted the outcome and was simply moving toward it on her own terms. Daniel's jaw tightened, his grip on the ration tightening with it, the foil crinkling softly in the wind as the numbers in his head kept repeating, 12 hours, maybe less, no margin for error, no second chances, and he took one step back, then another, turning away because that was the smart choice, the only choice, the one that kept him alive, and he made it 5 steps before he stopped, the sound of her uneven breathing still cutting through the wind behind him, refusing to fade, refusing to be ignored, and for a moment the valley felt smaller, quieter, like the world was waiting for something he didn't want to decide, something that didn't fit into numbers or calculations or survival charts, and slowly, reluctantly, he exhaled, the breath shaking just enough for him to notice, before he turned back around. The wind did not change, but something inside him did, a quiet shift that felt heavier than the pack on his shoulders as Daniel Hayes stepped back toward the girl and crouched a few feet away, the dust settling around his boots in thin, restless swirls while his eyes moved over her condition with the same precision he used for broken machines, noting the shallow rise of her chest, the dryness at the edges of her lips, the way her fingers trembled not from fear but from depletion, and he had seen that before, in mirrors, in others, in the slow erosion of strength that did not announce itself with noise, only with silence that grew louder every hour. He did not speak at first because words cost energy and he was not sure either of them could afford it. So instead he reached into his pack and pulled the ration free, the foil catching what little light filtered through the dust-choked sky. And for a moment he just held it there between them, suspended in a space that felt impossibly fragile, like the decision had not fully formed until now. Her eyes shifted to it almost immediately, not with hunger the way he expected, but with something more cautious, more distant, as if she did not trust what she was seeing, as if hope itself was a thing that could betray her, and that hesitation made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "It is food," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse, each word measured, steady, as if saying it too quickly might break the moment, and she blinked slowly, processing, her gaze flicking from the ration to his face and back again, searching for something he could not name, maybe intent, maybe a reason that made sense in her world, and when she did not move, he extended his arm a little further, closing the distance without stepping closer, because proximity could feel like pressure, and pressure could turn this into something else entirely. "You should not eat that," he added, glancing briefly at the toxic residue near her hand, then back to her, and this time she understood enough to pull her fingers away from it, though the effort seemed to cost her, her shoulders sagging slightly, as if even that small movement drained what little she had left. The wind passed between them again, carrying a faint hiss that filled the silence, and Daniel became aware of the weight in his hand, the finality of it, the simple fact that once he let go, there would be no taking it back, no recalculating the numbers, no adjusting the outcome, just a straight line from here to whatever came next, and he realized that he was no longer thinking about survival in terms of hours or calories, but in terms of something harder to measure, something that did not fit into any system he had trusted before. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the ration on the ground between them and withdrew his hand, palms open, a gesture as much for himself as for her, a way of saying that the choice had already been made. For a second, nothing happened, and then her hand moved, hesitant at first, then steadier as her fingers closed around the foil, her grip tightening as if she expected it to disappear, and she did not tear it open right away, did not consume it with the urgency he had seen in others. Instead she held it, studying it, then looking back at him again, her expression unreadable but focused, as if she was trying to understand the logic behind something that had no logic at all. "Why?" she asked quietly, the words shaped carefully, imperfect but clear enough, and Daniel let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh, but did not quite make it that far, because there was no good answer, no efficient explanation that justified the loss he had just accepted. He shook his head once, a subtle movement, and leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his knees as the emptiness in his stomach seemed to expand, sharp and immediate now that the decision was real. "Because I could," he said, the simplest truth he had, and for a moment the wind seemed to pause, as if even the world out here did not quite know what to do with that answer. And then she lowered her gaze to the ration again, her fingers beginning to open it with slow, careful movements while he turned his eyes toward the horizon, not watching, because if he watched, he might remember what it felt like to eat, and remembering would make the choice harder to carry, and he had already made it. The sound of tearing foil was softer than the wind, a fragile, deliberate motion that carried more weight than it should have as Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, the jagged line where the dead land met a sky that never quite changed, because looking at her would make it real in a different way, would turn the decision into something he could measure in seconds and bites and diminishing chances. And he had already committed to not measuring it anymore. He listened instead, the faint rustle of packaging, the pause that followed, and then the smallest intake of breath before she took her first bite, slow and careful, as if she did not trust her own body to accept it, and that restraint told him more than anything else could have, because hunger usually erased caution, but hers had not, which meant she had been holding on longer than most. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dust and distant minerals, and beneath it something else, something faint but noticeable now that his senses were sharpening in the absence of food, a reminder that his body was already compensating, already entering the stage where awareness increased just before it began to fail. He adjusted his stance slightly, lowering himself to sit on a flat piece of metal half buried in the ground, his movements slower than before, conserving what little energy he had left without consciously deciding to do so, because survival habits did not disappear, they just changed shape. Behind him, the sounds continued, measured, steady, no frantic tearing, no desperate pace, just controlled consumption, and that steadiness created a strange kind of calm between them, a rhythm that did not feel like a transaction or a rescue, but something quieter, something closer to coexistence. After a while, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed felt different from before, less empty, more aware, and he could feel her attention on him even without turning, a presence that had shifted from distant to focused. "You are losing energy," she said, the words clearer now, still careful but more certain, and Daniel let out a small breath through his nose, a faint acknowledgement rather than a denial, because there was no point in pretending otherwise, not out here where everything was visible if you knew how to look. "I will be fine," he replied, the sentence automatic, familiar, something he had said to himself more times than he could count, and as soon as it left his mouth he knew it sounded less convincing than it used to, thinner somehow, like the truth had worn it down over time. There was a brief pause, and then he heard movement, fabric shifting, the soft scrape of her adjusting her position, and finally, he turned his head just enough to see her from the corner of his eye, the ration wrapper folded neatly in her hand, not discarded, not forgotten, and that detail stood out more than anything else, because it meant she valued even the remains, even the smallest part of what had been given. Her posture was different now, still weak, but more stable, her breathing more even, her eyes clearer as they studied him with a focus that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. "On my world," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "food is kept, traded, never given, without return." Daniel shifted his gaze forward again, watching a thin line of dust spiral upward in the distance before dissolving into nothing, and he considered that for a moment, the idea of balance, of exchange, of systems that required equal input for equal output, and he understood it, because he had lived by something similar for a long time, not giving more than he could afford, not taking risks that did not offer clear returns. "Then your world runs on math," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing hollow feeling in his chest, and he let a faint hint of something almost like a smile touch the corner of his mouth before it faded. "This one does not." The wind carried his words away almost as soon as he spoke them, scattering them across the empty valley, but she heard them, he could tell, because she did not look away, did not dismiss the statement or challenge it. Instead, she watched him as if she was trying to understand a system that did not follow rules she recognized, and for a moment, in that quiet space between hunger and survival, between logic and choice, the distance between them felt smaller than the world around them. The wind carried less edge now, or maybe his body had simply stopped reacting to it the same way, the sharpness dulled by the slow drain of energy that made everything feel a fraction heavier, a fraction slower, as Daniel shifted his weight on the metal slab and pressed his palm briefly against his abdomen, not to ease the hunger but to acknowledge it, to track it the way he tracked everything else, because ignoring it never made it disappear. It just made it harder to manage when it finally demanded attention. The numbers in his head had stopped updating, not because they no longer mattered, but because they had reached a point where precision no longer changed the outcome, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty that felt strangely calm. Behind him, he heard her move again, not the unsteady motion from before, but something more controlled, more deliberate, and when he turned this time he did not hide it, letting his gaze meet hers fully as she pushed herself upright, one hand braced against the metal, the other still holding the folded wrapper like it was something worth keeping. The color had returned to her slightly, not fully, but enough to shift her presence from fading to present, and her eyes held him with a focus that no longer came from survival instinct alone. "You should rest," she said, her voice stronger now, the words forming with less effort, and there was something in the way she said it that carried intention rather than observation, as if she had moved from reacting to choosing. Daniel let out a slow breath and shook his head once, a small motion that took more effort than it should have, and he pushed himself to stand, the world tilting just slightly before settling back into place, a warning his body delivered without urgency, but with clarity. "Resting does not change the situation," he replied, his tone even, though he adjusted his stance to compensate for the brief instability, feet planted wider, shoulders squared, as if posture alone could reinforce what his energy could not. She watched that adjustment closely, her gaze tracking the subtle signs he could no longer fully conceal, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the wind filling the space between them with its constant, low presence. Then she stepped closer, not enough to crowd him, just enough to shift the distance from separate to shared, and she lowered herself onto the edge of the metal slab beside him with a careful motion that suggested she was still conserving strength despite the improvement. "On my world," she said again, slower this time, as if building something piece by piece. "When one loses energy, others provide structure, shelter, balance." Daniel glanced at her, then out at the empty stretch of land, the broken terrain that offered none of those things, just exposure and distance, and the faint promise of something better if you kept moving long enough. "There is no structure here," he said, a simple statement, not bitter, just factual, and she followed his gaze, taking in the same emptiness, the same lack of anything that could be called safety. "Then we make it," she replied, and the certainty in her voice was new, not drawn from strength but from decision, the kind that did not depend on conditions being favorable. He studied her for a moment, the way she sat, the way she held the wrapper, the way her breathing had steadied, and he realized that whatever line had existed between them before had shifted, not erased, but redrawn into something that neither of them had planned. The wind pressed against them again, carrying a thin layer of dust that settled across his sleeves, across her shoulders, blending them into the same muted landscape. And for the first time since he had turned back, Daniel did not feel like he was managing a problem or calculating an outcome. He felt like he was sharing a moment that did not need to be solved. His vision narrowed slightly at the edges, a subtle dimming that came and went, and he recognized it immediately. The next stage, the one that made movement harder, thought slower, but he did not move away, did not create distance again. Instead, he let himself remain where he was, grounded not by strength but by presence. And as the silence settled once more, it no longer felt like something waiting to end. It felt like something holding them in place, just long enough for something else to begin. The air felt thinner with each passing minute, not because the atmosphere had changed, but because Daniel's body was beginning to ration more than just energy. It was rationing clarity, narrowing his focus to what was directly in front of him as the edges of the world softened into something less defined. And he recognized it the same way he recognized a failing system, not with panic, but with quiet awareness that the threshold had been crossed. He shifted slightly on the metal slab, the movement slower now, deliberate in a way that was no longer strategic but necessary. And he kept his gaze forward even as the ground seemed to tilt just enough to remind him that balance was no longer guaranteed. Beside him, Saris remained still for a moment, watching, measuring in her own way. And then she turned her attention outward, scanning the barren stretch of land with a focus that mirrored his earlier caution, except now it carried a different weight, not survival alone, but responsibility shared. "There are patterns," she said after a while, her voice steady, more certain than before, and Daniel let the words settle before responding, because processing took longer now, each thought moving through a layer of resistance he could not push past. "What kind of patterns?" he asked, his tone low, controlled, and she gestured faintly toward the horizon where the terrain dipped into a shallow basin, the dust there moving differently, less chaotic, more contained, as if something interrupted the wind's path. "Flow disruption," she explained, searching for the right words, "means structure below, not visible, but present." Daniel followed her indication, narrowing his eyes slightly, forcing them to adjust, and after a moment he saw it too, not clearly, but enough to recognize the difference, a subtle break in the uniformity of the landscape that suggested something buried, something that might offer cover or at least a change in conditions. He exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, and leaned forward just enough to place his hands on his knees, grounding himself before attempting to stand again, because standing now required intention, not reflex. "That is at least half a mile," he said, estimating distance by habit, though the numbers felt less reliable than they used to, and she turned back to him, her expression focused but not dismissive. "Then we move half a mile," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no calculation of odds, just a simple acceptance of the next step, and that simplicity cut through his usual process in a way that felt unfamiliar. He let out a faint breath that might have been a quiet laugh if he had the energy for it, and shook his head slightly. "Movement increases energy loss," he said, repeating a principle that had guided him for years, and she held his gaze, unshaken. "Staying still guarantees it," she answered, and the logic was not flawed, it was just incomplete, but incomplete logic was still enough to move forward when standing still no longer offered advantage. Daniel considered that, the way she reframed the situation, not as a calculation of efficiency, but as a choice between outcomes that both carried cost, and he realized that his usual approach no longer applied in the same way, because the variables had changed, because he had changed them himself the moment he set the ration down. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, the motion uneven but controlled, his muscles responding with a delay that forced him to pause halfway before fully straightening. And when he did, the world narrowed again, a brief dimming at the edges that he steadied against by fixing his gaze on the distant dip in the land. Xenoryth rose beside him, her movement more stable now, though still measured, and she did not step ahead, did not take the lead. Instead, she aligned her pace with his, matching his slower rhythm without comment, without urgency, as if the act of moving together mattered more than the speed at which they did it. The wind pressed against them once more, carrying dust that settled into the folds of their clothing, softening the lines between them and the landscape. And as Daniel took the first step forward, he did not calculate the cost, did not measure the loss. He simply moved. One step, then another. The distance ahead no longer just a number, but a direction. And for the first time since the numbers had stopped matching, that was enough. Each step felt like it carried weight beyond his body, as if the ground itself resisted movement, pulling at Daniel's boots with a subtle drag that grew more noticeable the farther they went. And he stopped counting distance after the first 100 yards because numbers no longer helped him move forward. They only reminded him how far there was left to go. The horizon wavered slightly, not from heat, but from the strain in his vision, the edges of objects softening and sharpening in uneven cycles as his body tried to maintain focus with diminishing resources. And he kept his eyes fixed on the shallow basin ahead, because losing that point meant losing direction entirely. Xenoryth walked beside him in silence, her pace steady, measured to match his slower rhythm, and every few steps she adjusted slightly, not to guide him, but to remain aligned, as if the act of staying beside him was a decision she was actively maintaining rather than something that happened by chance. The wind shifted again, lower now, carrying less force but more consistency, a constant pressure that brushed against his suit and settled into the fabric, and he could hear the faint scrape of dust against material, a sound that repeated with each step, like a quiet metronome marking time he no longer tracked. His breathing had changed, deeper but less efficient, each inhale taking longer, each exhale leaving him with less than before, and he became aware of the rhythm slipping, the balance between intake and output no longer even, and he slowed without realizing it until Xenoryth matched the change instantly, her presence adjusting to his without a word. "You are compensating," she said after a moment, her voice calm, observational, and he let out a breath that almost formed a response but settled into silence. Instead, because explaining something his body already understood felt unnecessary. The ground beneath them shifted subtly as they approached the basin, the texture changing from brittle crust to something slightly more compact, the wind patterns altering just enough to confirm her earlier observation, and Daniel focused on that change, using it as a point of reference to keep moving, one step at a time, each one placed with care rather than speed. The distance closed slowly, the basin rising in his field of vision until it was no longer a distant shape but a defined depression in the land, its edges worn smooth by time and wind. And as they reached the outer slope, Daniel paused, not by choice but because his body required it, his legs holding but no longer pushing forward without resistance. He placed a hand against the side of the basin, the surface cooler than the open ground, and let the contact steady him for a moment, grounding his balance as the dimming at the edges of his vision pressed inward again. Xenoryth moved slightly ahead this time, stepping down into the shallow depression with careful footing, her posture more stable now, and she turned back toward him, her gaze steady, assessing not the terrain but him. "There is less exposure here," she said, her voice carrying a note of confirmation, and he nodded faintly, though the motion felt delayed, as if his body processed the command fraction of a second after his mind issued it. He stepped down after her, the change in elevation small, but enough to shift the wind's path, reducing its direct force and creating a pocket of relative stillness that felt almost unnatural after the constant pressure outside. The silence here was different, thicker, less scattered, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath uneven but deeper than before, as if the environment itself allowed for it. He lowered himself to sit against the inner slope, the motion controlled but final, his body accepting the position without resistance, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to rest but to stabilize the spinning that threatened to take hold if he kept them open too long. Beside him, Xenoryth knelt, her movements deliberate, and he felt her presence closer now, not intrusive, just present, a steady point in a world that had begun to blur, and as the wind passed over the basin, without fully reaching them, the space between movement and stillness settled into something that felt almost like shelter, even if it was only temporary. The quiet inside the basin held differently, not empty but contained, like the world had narrowed just enough to make each sound distinct, and Daniel could hear his own breathing in a way he had not before, uneven, deeper on the inhale, thinner on the exhale, a rhythm that felt like it was slipping out of alignment with itself. And he kept his eyes closed for a moment longer than he intended, letting the darkness settle behind them because it required less effort than focusing on a horizon that no longer stayed still. The ground at his back was cool, a contrast to the dry heat that had pressed against him for hours, and that small difference registered as something significant, something his body recognized as relief even if his mind did not fully process it. When he opened his eyes again, the light felt sharper, the edges of the basin more defined for a brief second before softening again, and he steadied himself by fixing his gaze on a single point along the inner slope, a small fracture line in the surface that did not move, did not shift, something stable in a field of gradual distortion. Xenoryth remained close, her posture low, one hand resting against the ground as if she was testing it, feeling for something beneath the surface that he could not perceive, and her focus was no longer on him alone. It extended outward, scanning, assessing in a way that suggested her earlier observation had not been casual. "There is density below," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Daniel turned his head slightly, the motion slower now, his attention following her hand as it traced a subtle line along the basin wall. "What kind of density?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than before, each word requiring a fraction more effort, and she paused, considering, then pressed her palm more firmly against the surface, her fingers splayed as if measuring something. "Unseen, not natural," she replied, the words coming with more certainty now, patterned, structured, covered by time. Daniel let that settle, the idea of something beneath them, something hidden but intact, and he shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his position to lean forward, curiosity pushing against the fatigue just enough to create movement. "A facility," he said, the word more assumption than conclusion, and she inclined her head slightly, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging the possibility. The wind passed over the basin again, lighter here, almost distant, and in that relative stillness the ground beneath them seemed to carry a faint vibration, so subtle he might have missed it if he had not been so still, so attuned to every change in his environment. He stilled further, focusing on that sensation, and after a moment it came again, not a tremor, not a shift, but a low, consistent hum that felt less like movement and more like presence. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his gaze lifting slightly, scanning the basin as if the source might reveal itself, and Xenoryth nodded once, her expression sharpening as she followed the same sensation. "Residual energy," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reverent, dormant, but not gone. Daniel let out a slow breath, the air leaving him with a faint tremor he could not fully control, and he leaned back again, conserving what remained of his strength as the realization settled in. Shelter was one thing, but energy meant something else entirely, something that could change the equation in ways he had not allowed himself to consider since his supplies had run out. "If it is dormant," he said carefully, "it may not respond." And she turned toward him fully now, her gaze steady, her focus clear in a way it had not been before. "It will respond," she answered, not with certainty drawn from data, but from something deeper, something instinctive, and she shifted her position, moving closer to the point where the vibration felt strongest, her movements deliberate despite the residual weakness in her frame. Daniel watched her, the edges of his vision narrowing again, the world dimming slightly as his body reminded him of its limits, and he let his head rest back against the slope for a moment, not closing his eyes this time, but allowing them to soften as he tracked her movements. She knelt fully now, both hands pressed against the ground, her posture aligned in a way that suggested intent rather than rest, and the basin seemed to hold its breath with her, the quiet deepening, the air stilling just enough to make the faint hum beneath them more noticeable. Daniel did not move, did not speak, he simply watched, his awareness narrowing to that single point where her hands met the ground, where something unseen waited beneath layers of time and dust, and for the first time since his strength began to fade, he felt a shift that was not internal, not the slow loss he had been tracking, but something external, something waiting to be found, and as the silence stretched, it no longer felt like an end, It felt like a threshold. The hum beneath the ground deepened, not louder in volume, but clearer in shape, like a signal that had decided to be heard, and Daniel felt it through his back where it rested against the basin wall. A low, steady presence that vibrated just enough to anchor his fading awareness to something outside himself, something real, and he focused on that sensation because it required less effort than holding his thoughts together. Xenoryth did not move her hands from the surface, her posture unwavering despite the strain it must have carried, and there was a subtle change in her breathing, slower now, more controlled, as if she was matching something beneath them rather than reacting to it. "It recognizes input," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of certainty that had not been there before, and Daniel turned his head slightly, the motion delayed but intentional, his eyes settling on her with effort that felt disproportionate to the distance. "Input from what?" he asked, though the question felt distant even as he formed it, like it belonged to a different state of mind, one that operated on logic rather than the thin edge of endurance he now occupied. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted her position, pressing both palms more firmly against the ground, her fingers spreading wider, and for a moment the air around them seemed to shift, not in temperature or pressure, but in presence, like something unseen had turned its attention toward them. Daniel felt it then, not through his hands but through the base of his spine, a faint pulse that rose and faded in a steady interval, and his breath caught slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that the environment was no longer passive. "Biological resonance," she said finally, the words careful but confident. "It responds to living patterns." Daniel let that settle, the meaning filtering through the haze in fragments, and he nodded faintly, though the motion felt disconnected from the thought. "So it is not the structure," he said slowly. "It is us." She inclined her head once, and there was a quiet intensity in her gaze now, a focus that extended beyond survival, beyond immediate need, into something that felt almost like purpose. "It is you," she corrected gently, and that distinction registered with a weight he could not fully process, but he understood enough to recognize its significance. The hum shifted again, a slight variation in frequency that made the ground beneath them feel less like a surface and more like a threshold, and Daniel's vision narrowed further, the edges darkening as his body reached deeper into its reserves, and he exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, his chest tightening with the effort. "I do not have much left," he said, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact, and Xenoryth looked at him then, fully, her expression no longer distant or analytical, but something else entirely, something that held recognition, understanding that went beyond language. "You have enough," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, just a quiet certainty that seemed to anchor itself in the space between them. She shifted closer, one hand lifting from the ground and hovering for a brief moment before resting lightly against his forearm, the contact minimal but deliberate, and Daniel felt it immediately, a contrast to the cold air, a point of warmth that drew his attention back from the edge of fading. "Stay with me," she added, the words soft but firm, and he let out a breath that trembled slightly, his focus narrowing to her voice, to the sensation of her hand, to the steady pulse beneath them that now seemed to align with his own slowing rhythm. The ground responded again, the hum deepening, not louder but more defined, and a faint line appeared along the basin wall where her other hand still pressed, a thin seam of light that traced itself slowly across the surface, not bright, not sudden, just present, like something waking after a long stillness. Daniel watched it with what remained of his clarity, his eyes following the line as it extended, and for a moment the exhaustion receded just enough to allow a single, coherent thought to form, not about survival, not about numbers or distance, but about the simple fact that something had answered, something had seen them, and as the faint light spread, the silence in the basin shifted once more, no longer empty, no longer waiting, but responding. The thin line of light along the basin wall did not flare or expand with urgency. It moved with quiet intention, tracing a path that felt measured, almost deliberate, as if whatever lay beneath was not reacting in panic but waking with awareness. And Daniel followed it with eyes that struggled to stay focused, the glow soft against the dimming edges of his vision, something steady to hold on to as everything else began to slip. The hum beneath them shifted again, deeper now, layered, like multiple tones aligning into a single pattern, and he felt it through his bones more than his skin, a resonance that matched the slow, uneven rhythm of his breathing, not overpowering it, but synchronizing with it in a way that felt intentional. Saris did not remove her hand from his arm, her touch light but constant, and her other hand remained pressed against the ground where the light had first appeared, her posture unmoving except for the controlled rise and fall of her chest as she maintained whatever connection she had established. "It is opening," she said softly, and Daniel turned his head slightly, the effort costing more now, but he needed to see, needed to confirm that what he was sensing was real and not just the final distortions of a failing body. The seam of light widened by fractions of an inch, not enough to reveal depth, but enough to suggest separation, a boundary giving way, and the surface of the basin wall shifted almost imperceptibly, the texture smoothing along the illuminated line as if responding to an unseen command. He exhaled slowly, the breath thin, and let his head rest back again, his body no longer resisting the pull toward stillness, because resisting required energy he did not have, and for the first time since he had stepped into this basin, he allowed himself to stop trying to manage the outcome. "I might not make it inside," he said quietly, the words forming without urgency, without fear, just an acknowledgement of probability, and Saris turned toward him fully, her expression steady, her gaze clear in a way that cut through the haze surrounding him. "You already did," she replied, and there was no metaphor in her tone, no attempt to comfort, just a statement that carried a different kind of truth, one that did not depend on physical position or distance traveled. The hum intensified slightly, not louder, but more present, and the line of light extended downward, forming a narrow vertical plane that separated from the surrounding surface, creating the outline of an opening that had not existed moments before. Daniel watched it with what remained of his awareness, the movement slow enough for him to follow, deliberate enough to feel purposeful, and as the opening formed, a faint shift in the air reached him, cooler, cleaner, carrying a trace of something he had not sensed in days, moisture, not enough to measure, but enough to recognize. His chest tightened briefly, not from strain, but from the sudden memory of what that meant, and he let out a breath that trembled at the edges. Saris adjusted her position slightly, her hand on his arm tightening just enough to anchor him as the environment changed, and she leaned closer, her voice lowering as if speaking to him alone despite the presence of something far larger surrounding them. "Your kind gives without return," she said, each word deliberate, carrying weight, beyond simple observation. And this place responds to that. Daniel let his eyes close for a moment, not to withdraw, but to hold on to the sound of her voice, to the steadiness of it. And when he opened them again, the opening in the basin wall was fully formed, a narrow passage of soft light that did not glare or blind, but invited, its edges smooth, its presence calm. He did not move toward it, not because he chose not to, but because his body no longer responded with the same immediacy. The connection between intention and action stretched thin, and he remained where he was, seated against the inner slope, the world narrowing further as his energy reached its limit. Saris did not leave his side, did not rush toward the opening. Instead, she stayed with him, her hand still on his arm, her presence steady, and for a moment neither of them moved, the basin holding them in a quiet that was no longer empty, but full of something unspoken. The light reflected faintly in her eyes as she looked at him, and there was no urgency there, no fear, just a quiet understanding that seemed to bridge the distance between their worlds. Daniel exhaled one last slow breath, the tension in his body easing as he let it go, and in that final moment of clarity, as the hum beneath them steadied and the air shifted with the promise of something beyond the barren surface, a single thought settled into place, simple and complete. He had not survived by holding on. He had survived by letting go. And as the light continued to glow softly beside them, the silence that followed was not an end, but something that felt like being seen.